Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am your host, Erik Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. The Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for everybody who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel, whether that's at work or at home, which means it is pretty much for everybody, especially anyone whose job requires them to take care of fuel because they need to use that fuel to get the job done, whatever that job may happen to be. And so if you think that sounds like you, then the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is going to be for you. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about the subject of fuel testing. Now, if that sounds a little bit boring, then more specifically today we're going to talk about the top 10 most important fuel tests that you should consider if your goal is preserving and maintaining the health of any stored fuel that might be under your care or responsibility. So that concept, preserving and maintaining stored fuel health, when it comes to that very important goal, there are plenty of proposed solutions out there. There are plenty of ways that various people think are the best way to do that. And we know lots of people have something to say about how best to do that very important thing. So depending on who you talk to, the vast majority of their recommendations can tend to focus heavily on just one type of solution. So, for example, if you're talking to a fuel additive company, they may tell you that all your problems are solved or will be solved just by adding a particular fuel additive to the fuel. In other words, fuel additives are going to solve all your problems. You don't need anything else. On the other hand, switch to talking to a fuel polisher, and they may sell you on a service of filtering the fuel only. Now, don't get me wrong, filtering and polishing are going to do something useful for you and your stored fuel. But when they make certain kinds of claims, like the only thing you need to do is to polish your fuel, the implication undergirding that is that polishing is going to solve all your problems. When they say that, they're implying that fuel filtration and fuel polishing are the only things you really need. The reality of things is that the actual best solutions or proposals for taking care of stored fuel necessarily involve not just one thing, but more than one thing. Sometimes when we talk about this, sometimes we will refer to the best solution as what we call a hybrid approach. And the truth behind this hybrid approach is that in order to take care of stored fuel properly, you don't just need one thing, you need three things. And those three things are chemical, mechanical, and testing elements. And so we're going to talk about each of these a little bit. So the key thesis here is that for best practice fuel care, none of these three things are completely enough just by themselves. To properly take care of stored fuel, you need to consider all three of these things together because each of them covers an important aspect of fuel health, and none of them all by themselves covers all of the bases adequately. You need all three. For example, there are plenty of good things, plenty of important things that chemical fuel additives will do. But fuel additive chemicals cannot do key things that mechanical fuel care, in other words, filtering, can do. And filtering or fuel polishing, while it does do certain things that chemicals can't do by themselves, there are plenty of things that filtering or polishing alone cannot do. An example of this might be solving a microbial problem or fixing a fuel problem where the stability rating is excessively low. For those things, you would need a chemical treatment used as part of the process. Fuel polishing alone would not solve either of those problems by itself. So, since chemical treatment and mechanical processes can't each do everything you need by itself, this means that now you're really required to think of more than one thing. You're required to think of two or even three things instead of just one of them alone. Now, we mentioned chemical, we mentioned mechanical. There is a third element that to this point we haven't really mentioned yet, but we're going to talk a lot more about it. And of the three aspects that we listed before, this third thing, testing, is the most underrated. You might even say it's the most overlooked of the three. And this is unfortunate, and this is to the industry's detriment because testing is extremely important for taking care of stored fuel and keeping it healthy. Now, why is testing important? Why is it important? Because testing gives you something unique that the other two things really don't. And that thing is, testing gives you an objective picture or snapshot of a specific meaningful property of the fuel. And this is important because fuel properties directly relate to what the fuel can and cannot do for you. I said that fuel testing was the underrated one of the three. Well, why is testing underrated? Why is it forgotten compared to these other solutions? Probably because for many kinds of tests, not everyone has the ability, not everyone has the equipment to do a lot of these important tests themselves, which means they can't do them themselves. They have to send them off somewhere else to be done. They have to send a fuel sample away to a laboratory, for example. And when you have to do something like that, there's an aspect to that that's similar to the old concept of out of sight, out of mind. If the problem isn't in plain view, or the solution to the problem you think you have, if that solution itself requires multiple steps, including some which you can't do yourselves, you have to have somebody else do. Naturally, that will tend to make that whole scenario less top of mind because you can't do it yourself. You're relying on somebody else. And when that happens, we're less inclined to remember that the particular thing undergirding that is actually important. So testing can be somewhat underrated or forgotten compared to these other things. So, chemical, mechanical testing, the three really important and essential elements of proper fuel health maintenance, so to speak. Now, with respect to fuel tests, there are certain important tests you can do yourself if you have the right tools. We're going to talk about at least one of those later. But for the vast majority of the most important tests, in order to do them right, in order to do those tests properly, you really do have to send them to a lab to execute the test methodology. Indeed, this idea that in order to do many kinds of important testing means you have to have a lab to do them for you, this speaks to how testing can be fundamentally different in its very nature than the chemical or the mechanical elements of proper fuel care. So let's talk what we mean by that, because that sounds kind of fancy. So let's unpack that a little bit. What do we mean when we say it's fundamentally different by its very nature? Well, first point is when a lab executes or runs a test method, test protocol, when the lab does this, or rather, to back up a moment, the requirement to have a lab do this, I think that's really what I really meant to say. The requirement to have a lab do a test method, that ensures that the test is done in a controlled setting and is done properly by a defined procedure, and that procedure is executed the same way by everybody, everywhere, all of the time. Now, this characteristic, a statistician would look at that and they would label that characteristic something that they would call repeatability. And it's an important characteristic. Now, why does the characteristic of repeatability matter to us? Repeatability, when you're talking about testing fuel properties, repeatability means that the test results that you get and the results that you're looking at and that you're then drawing conclusions from, Repeatability means that those results are inherently transferable or comparable, and they're comparable across both geography and time. Now, what do we mean by that? Why is that important enough for us to talk about it? It means, for example, and let's take an example to illustrate this. You go to a truck stop, any truck stop, doesn't matter whether you're in Florida, Kansas, Oregon, doesn't matter. You go to any truck stop, you go to the fuel pump, to the diesel fuel pump, and you're going to see diesel fuel cetane value, cetane rating for that diesel fuel. And when you see those, the expectation is inherent. It goes without being said that the cetane rating that you see in Florida means the same thing as cetane rating you might find at a truck stop in Oregon or in Manitoba, Canada, or Mexico City, wherever. Indeed, whenever people look at something like cetane rating, or switch to the consumer side, they look at the octane for premium gasoline or regular gasoline. Whenever people look at these kinds of things for different fuels at different times and at different locations, there's an implicit assumption that goes without saying that if they have diesel fuel and they see 2 or 3 or 4 different cetane values, and whether that's for the same fuel at different times or different fuels from different locations. It goes without saying that there is an underlying meaningful basis for comparison for all of those tests. And that basis is that the cetane values came from the results of a test method that was designed to produce comparable results. Another way of putting it is it's assumed that the technicians at the lab, it's assumed that they ran these cetane tests in the same way. They used the same procedure. They used and implemented the same controls. And if you can assume all those things to be true, then it really does become an apples to apples comparison when you're comparing cetane value of number 2 diesel in Oregon versus cetane value of diesel fuel in Detroit. It becomes an apples to apples comparison. You have a reliably meaningful basis on which to say that those results are comparable in whatever way you're doing it. That is really important if you're going to reference those results to draw meaningful conclusions and make meaningful decisions based on what you think those results are telling you. So if you have diesel fuel and taken from 2 different tanks, and one of those tanks shows a cetane rating of 39 and the other one shows a cetane rating of 44, because the cetane rating test is designed to give comparable results, you can draw meaningful conclusions and say tank number 1 is less than tank number 2 and I need to do something. So that's an inherent characteristic of these tests, and part of the reason why they're valuable is that it enables you to do that. So those are some of the characteristics that speak to the value of testing in contrast to chemical or mechanical fuel care. And they speak to what makes testing a unique but very valuable part of this best practice hybrid approach to fuel management that we're talking about. Now, a minute ago, one of the things that we mentioned was that one of testing's biggest values is in it telling you something important about the fuel. And while this is true, telling you something important only matters if you know what that important thing actually means. And it only matters if you're aware of the factors that might cause you to make an error in deciphering what that test result actually means. Now, I'll admit that is a little bit of a convoluted way of saying that there are things that we need to be aware of if we're going to be correct about what a test result is telling us. There's things that we need to be aware of if we're going to correctly interpret what a test result is telling us. So let's unpack some of these important considerations around that concept, things that we would do well to keep in mind. So the first important thing to keep in mind involves knowing what a test does and does not tell you. Now, this matters because knowing what a test does and does not, or is and is not telling you, this helps when it comes down to picking the right test to tell you what you think you need to know. Let's say that you have, or you think you have, a specific problem. And you need to confirm if you have that problem. You need to maybe assess how bad that problem is. And depending on how bad it is, that's going to influence you to go this way or this way. Just depends. So you have a specific problem. You need to know what test that you're going to use to tell you if you're right about your suspicions. So let's do a more concrete example. Let's say you have a storage tank. Storage tanks have filters, as we know. Sometimes these filters get plugged. Well, you have a storage tank, your tank filters are plugging at an abnormally high rate. So this is different. This is unusual. So you strongly suspect that you have a problem. And you really need to determine why they're plugging, because the answer to why is going to tell you what you need to do to stop them from plugging and possibly stop other problems associated with that. So, how do you do this? Well, you could conduct a test to give you more information. That sounds like a good plan to start with, but it's only going to help you if you choose the right test that gives you the right information about your situation. So what if in trying to figure out this filter plugging issue, what if you said, I don't know, let's run a flashpoint test on the fuel? Okay, well, flashpoint is a legit test, and the flashpoint test does tell you something useful, maybe even essential about the fuel. But for your case, the filter plugging case, flashpoint is not the right test to do because it's not going to tell you, or the information it's going to give you is not going to be relevant to what you actually need to know in this case, which is what's causing my tank filters to plug at an abnormally high rate. So that would be a case where if you chose to do a flashpoint test, that would be the wrong test. Now, if you knew from the beginning, or from the onset rather, what the flashpoint test is going to tell you and what that means, then you probably will be able to make the pretty important determination. Flashpoint's not the right test. Let's look at this other one. So that's important. So having said all this, if the test that you choose doesn't actually tell you what you need to know, let's say you make the mistake and you do run a flashpoint test, mistakenly thinking that it's going to shed some valuable light on your situation. So if the test you choose doesn't actually tell you what you need to know, and as in most of these kind of situations, you don't actually know that, then you may end up making a costly mistake because it may cause you to take action when you don't need to, which is a waste, or sometimes worse, you don't end up taking action on a potentially serious problem that you really do have because you picked a test that didn't actually speak to the problem at hand. And that if you had made the right decision, if you had chosen the right test, that would have been helpful and would have helped you make the right decision to solve the problem. Now, related to all this is another consideration. Not just picking the right test, but the importance and not just knowing what a test that you're considering is and is not going to tell you. Those are important. This is a little bit of one step above that, and that is the importance of knowing what the specific test is actually telling you, even if it is the right one. Let's put it another way. It's the importance of knowing how to interpret the test results correctly. That sounds important, right? And it is. It means correctly assessing or interpreting. Interpreting is probably a better word. Correctly interpreting what those test results specifically mean for your fuel situation in that moment. Now, let's put a pin in that point because we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. So just hold that thought that it's important to do the right kind of test that will tell you what you need to know. And it's important to know how to interpret what those test results do and do not mean for you. So hold that thought. We will come back to that. Now, let's talk about choosing different kinds of tests. Now, in the broad, vast landscape of field testing, there are, I don't know, hundreds of different kinds of tests you could do on the fuel. The most important ones, the most important fuel tests, are the tests that tell you what you most need to know. And what you need to know depends on what's important to you in your situation. What kind of information will help shed light on your specific problem that you're trying to wrestle with? Better yet, what kind of information is good to have to help you monitor if your fuel's condition is changing or getting ready to change in a way that implies you need to do that. And we're going to unpack the difference between those two things in a minute. But what I just said was basically implied that there are tests that you can use to assess the condition of your fuel and predict if there's a problem. And there are other tests that you can use after you think you have a problem to try and help you identify what that problem is and what you should do about it. So maybe that's a better way of putting it. So let's talk about that idea. For stored fuel that doesn't appear to have an overt problem that needs attention in the moment, then that doesn't mean that you're just going to ignore that fuel. In fact, you absolutely do not want to ignore that fuel. What you want to do, you probably want to know if the fuel's condition is where it should be, which is basically the answer to, is there something about the fuel that I need to take action on right now? So that's number one. The other thing is, the other thing that you probably will want to know is how long or how soon is it likely that I'm going to have to take action? Or a better way to put it, how long is my fuel likely to stay in that nice, pristine, problem-free condition? In other words, do you need to take action now? Or how soon are you likely to need to take action in the future? And fuel testing, if you pick the right tests, will give you information that will make both of those questions more answerable for you. Both of those concepts, is the fuel's condition good right now, or is it likely to change in the future? Both of those concepts can be meaningfully informed by the right kind of test. And such a test, or sometimes tests, plural, might tell you first if the fuel isn't in the condition you need it to be, and it might tell you in what way the fuel's condition is falling short of what's required. If you know those things, that's really important information that you can then use to know what, if anything, you need to do next. Instead of just throwing a dart and guessing at things. So up to this point, we've talked mainly about conceptual stuff concerning testing. We talked about conceptual stuff like what the practice of testing does and does not tell you, what's important to keep in mind as far as what testing means, what the limits of testing are as far as the information it gives you, and why those limits matter. Now let's shift gears a little bit and start tying all of this together by talking about some specific tests that we might want to consider. Remember, we said that what we were going to do is end up talking about the top 10 most important tests that you need to consider if you manage stored fuel and you want to keep it healthy. So to tie those conceptual things we were talking about into specific tests, we need to dig a little bit more into the idea we just talked about of the need to know what a test is actually telling you. So as we move forward talking about these most important tests, when we start talking about the number 10, number 9, number 8, going up to what we think is the number one most important fuel test that you need to keep in mind, As we move forward talking about those things, we first have to acknowledge that in the whole landscape of fuel tests, when you look at all the different kinds of fuel tests that you could consider doing, we talk about that there are two general classes of tests. All these tests can be divided into two classes. Those classes are descriptive tests, number one, and inferential or predictive tests, number two. Descriptive and predictive. So let's talk about what each of these means and maybe try to shed some light on why we're talking about it. What's the point of talking about those two things? So descriptive tests. A descriptive test tells you or describes for you some specific attribute about a direct property of the fuel right at that moment, at a specific moment in time. So that's descriptive test. It describes what's actually true about a property of the fuel right then. Then in contrast, the second one, predictive or inferential tests, they don't necessarily just tell you what's true about a certain fuel property at a moment in time. More likely, rather, predictive tests give you information that is supposed to correlate with it's supposed to correlate with what's going to be true about the fuel in the future. Now, if that sounds kind of confusing, we're going to clarify what we mean by that. So, an example of a descriptive test could be flashpoint, the flashpoint of gasoline. Well, flashpoint, of course, if you remember, is the temperature at which, if you have enough oxygen and the given thing is vaporized and you expose it to a flame, it will ignite. Flashpoint. Or water content. What percentage weight is in a given liquid sample is water. So flashpoint water content. Viscosity would be another one. Those are descriptive tests. They describe pretty directly the properties of something that you're testing. Even something like a microbial test could be considered descriptive, describing something true about that fuel with respect to microbial content. Although, as we're going to see a little bit later, some microbial tests can actually also be inferential. But we'll unpack that a little bit more later. So these kind of descriptive tests, flashpoint, water content, viscosity, distillation, they give you a specific and direct measurement of something about the fuel that's true at that given moment. They describe it. So flashpoint, the fuel ignites in the presence of a flame and oxygen at X degrees Fahrenheit. That's the flashpoint temperature. So flashpoint, good example of a descriptive test. Now the other one, the inferential tests, or we might call them predictive tests. They don't really, many of them do give you some kind of result that describes something about the fuel right now. But the best thing that we can say here is that that's not the primary use for these kind of tests. The primary use is the fact that when you take the results of a predictive test and you try to answer the question, what does this tell me what I should do? Interpretation of these kind of results is really filtered through a larger question. To put another way, the main value of the results of an inferential or a predictive test lies in what it shows you that you can infer or predict about the fuel in the future. Let's give you an example that might better clarify this, because if we stop there, you're probably going to be confused about what we're talking about. So, a good example of an inferential or a predictive test is oxidative stability. If you're a fuel professional, you have come across that test before. So there is a certain test, oxidative stability test, and the information that it gives you is it generates something that it calls a stability rating. Now, there's no stability measurement in the same sense that you can measure a flashpoint or you can measure the ppm by weight of water that's in a fuel. Stability measurements aren't like that, but a stability measurement's more like what they call an index. When you put fuel through an oxidative stability test method and you get a result, it's expressed in terms of an index. And you can take that index result and you will use that to draw conclusions, not necessarily about what the fuel's like right then, but you're more concerned about being able to say, what is the fuel going to be like? What's the condition of the fuel going to be like in the future? And that's important. That matters because, as we're going to see later, the property of fuel stability, oxidative stability, thermal stability, these properties of fuel stability is something where, uh, 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 depending on what it is, the proper action that you're going to take is preventative. That means that it's going to head off a problem in the future, which means there's substantial monetary incentive to get that right, because preventive action's always cheaper than fixing a problem after it occurs, right? Okay, so we are 30 minutes in. We've talked a lot about background issues that we think we need to understand to help understand what fuel testing is all about, understand that a little better. Hopefully, to this point, you have at least a little better, a little broader picture of the things you want to think about when it comes to fuel testing in order to be able to understand fuel testing properly. Now we're going to get to the good stuff here. Important tests to consider for stored fuel. That's what we said we were going to talk about at the beginning. So, the important tests, the most important tests for fuel are the tests that either confirm what the condition of the fuel is right now, or they give you a useful idea of whether a fuel's condition is going to change in the future and how likely that is to happen sooner rather than later. And when we say in the future, we're not talking about this nebulous idea of, eventually will the fuel properties or fuel specifications change, fuel condition change. Is it going to happen eventually? We don't really mean that. When we say in the future, we're really inferring sooner than that. Soon enough that it means you probably need to take action right now to head that off. So, as you remember, those two things, confirming the condition of the fuel or giving an idea of whether the fuel is going to change in the future, what do those relate to? Remember, we were just talking about. One is descriptive, one is predictive or inferential. Now, so the most important tests are going to fall into one of those two camps, so to speak. Another thing to know about these most important tests is that many of them are what we call ASTM tests. If you've been in the industry, if you don't know what ASTM is, you have at least likely heard about it, but you may not know exactly what it is. And in order to do any of these tests, you don't need to know exactly what ASTM is, but if you understand the significance of a test being identified with, let's say, an ASTM number, that actually will help you understand or better, to say it better, give you more confidence that of more confidence in the significance of the test results that you're getting. So let's talk a little bit briefly about what this ASTM thing is. ASTM is an acronym, stands for American Society for Testing and Materials. And ASTM is a group. It's a, consortium, whatever you want to call it. It's a group, coalition of industry and government stakeholders, experts in particular fields. And they together set the standards for performance. They define the standards for performance, if you will, for just about anything that you come across in the market that's in your personal and professional lives. And then ASTM also not only defines those standards, but also defines how to measure those standards, how to measure properties of given things. So let's give an example that's relevant to what we're talking about. Diesel fuel. number 2 diesel fuel specifically, because if you recall, diesel fuel actually refers to diesel fuel oil, and there's different grades of that. So we're going to talk about number 2. ASTM defines, with respect to diesel fuel, has a definition of what characteristics, what properties diesel fuel has to have in order to legally be called diesel fuel. And then they also define how you determine, how you measure those, how you find out what those properties are. That really means what tests you do. Another example that might hit close to home in a different area, the office chair that you might use. There's foam in that office chair, right? Well, there's an ASTM standard that defines for a given grade of foam that's in that chair, how much it can compress, and then what test you use and how to run whatever test that you're going to use to measure the compressibility of that foam. So ASTM has something related to that. It really is a very broad and wide-ranging and influential organization. Now, why is ASTM good? Because we're going to define from the outset that it's really good for the consumer and good for the professional that ASTM does what it does. Now, why is that? Well, when ASTM is involved in these kind of areas we've been talking about, what in effect you've got a group of experts that are keeping watch over things, and they are defining things so that we don't have to do that. And so the result is we end up with reliable and reputable standards on which everyone can then proceed with confidence. You don't end up with a situation where a petroleum chemist who is an expert about things like gasoline and diesel is being disputed by a garage mechanic on what's the best way to determine the flash point of naphtha. No, you've got a consortium of experts who have already determined that. The garage mechanic, who doesn't really know that much about it, or at least doesn't know anywhere near as much as those other experts, isn't really going to have a say. And he shouldn't, because he's not an expert in that area of study. So really important for what we're talking about with respect to ASTM. Okay, let's narrow this in a little bit more, because we're going to be talking about fuel and fuel management. So let's narrow the focus of ASTM in a little bit more. ASTM sets the standard for defining what different fuels are, basically. And so for diesel fuel, which is what the majority of stored fuel is, there is a standard from ASTM that defines the properties that diesel fuel has to have. That standard is D975. Typically, you'll have a number or letter rather, and then a number. Could be 2, 3, or 4-digit number. So D975, ASTM D975 is the standard that defines diesel fuel oil. And the properties that are listed in D975 are defined or determined by specific ASTM tests, which means those individual tests themselves are going to be important too, because they're important because they tell you how to find out or how to measure, determine what an essential property of diesel fuel oil is. So we're probably going to see a few of those individual tests ending up in our top 10. So that is ASTM. That's why ASTM is important. And that is why when you see a given test, if it's got an ASTM number attached to it or assigned to it, that's important. And the reason that is important is that you can have confidence. This is not something I touched on earlier, but we have to stress this. Having an ASTM test number is important because what it essentially means is that a group of experts who know more about that particular subject than just about anybody else have vetted and validated and looked over and run the test and have basically signed off on it and said, yes, that test tells you what it says it tells you. And that's important. And so we're going to see quite a few of those ASTM tests in our top 10 list. And so, with all that being tested, we want to transition into talking about the top 10 most important tests for stored diesel fuel, maintaining stored diesel fuel health. If your goal is to know what's most important about your diesel fuel, we think that these 10 tests are the most important tests to consider to help you do that. Now, some of these tests, but not all of them, are found in ASTM D975. Again, D975 is important because it's the standard that legally defines what diesel fuel is. And before we kick into the top 10, we want to make sure you understand well what we mean when we said it defines what diesel fuel is. What do we mean by that? Well, if you look at D975, you can Google it and find yourself a copy. When you look at 975, you're going to come across a page that has a list of different tests. And those tests will have maximum or minimum or properties or a range that are associated with them. So some of those might be flash point, might be cetane rating, might be viscosity, might be distillation, T90 distillation properties. Now, when you get 9 or 10 or 11 of those together in D975, when you put all those together, what that does is it creates a definition where if something meets all of these 8 or 9 or 10, however many standards, if it meets all of these standards, then it can legally be called diesel fuel. You can sell that thing as diesel fuel. You can label it for commerce as diesel fuel, anything like that. Now, if you've got something that you think is diesel fuel, and you test it, of course, and it doesn't meet one or more of those requirements, then technically it is not diesel fuel. Doesn't meet the legal definition of diesel fuel. Now, someone might raise their hand. Someone might say, well, and this is something that happens quite often, so we should clarify this. Someone raise their hands and says, well, I had diesel fuel at one time, came from the refinery, bought it from a fuel supplier. It was what they call in spec. It met all of these requirements. But then at some point, something happened. And one of those properties fell out of specification. Is it not diesel fuel now? Well, legally, I don't know. Probably not. But that's not the way we treat that kind of thing colloquially in the real world. What we would say is, because it was defined as diesel fuel at one time, we're still going to call it diesel fuel, but we're going to say that diesel fuel is out of spec. It's out of specification. And if you've done the right testing and you've identified which property it fails in, then that will actually tell you what you need to do to correct that thing. Because you do want to correct it, because depending on what property it fails in, that can cause problems when you try to use it. And so, you want to correct that. Okay, last point here. Some people get tripped up by this idea of when I say, if something meets all 9 of these tests, if it meets it, then that is diesel fuel. That's the legal definition. Now, in their mind, they might be thinking that, well, what if something slips through the cracks? I mean, what if, I don't know, I have this batch of weird, lemonade, and we test it, and somehow it passes all those tests. So that lemonade's diesel fuel? What are you talking about? Well, if you think about it, though, this situation that we have right now, where D975 with its 9 or 10 or 11 tests is the base definition for calling something diesel fuel. That is actually a more robust and more exacting standard than you might first think. Okay, so let's take that lemonade, if you really think about it, and if you saw the kinds of tests that you have to do, there's really no possibility in the physical world that something that's as different as lemonade is going to meet those particular D975 standards. And it's not even going to be close. First one is flashpoint. Well, diesel fuel is a petroleum product. So it's going to have a flash point of, I don't know, 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Lemonade is water-based, which means it's not going to have a flash point at all. And remember, if it fails one of these things, it's not diesel fuel. So this, if you have this kind of suspicion in your mind, like, I don't know, maybe that somebody's going to make a mistake. Actually, the way D975's definition of diesel fuel is set up is actually pretty foolproof. And so that's it. We've gone through all of this background to explain all about what we need to keep in mind about fuel testing. And so we're going to kick off our top 10 most important fuel tests. These are the top 10 most important fuel tests that you may want to consider at various points. You may want to consider using to help you keep an accurate view of the condition of your stored fuel. Each of these tests tells us something particularly valuable or helpful about the fuel and its condition. So we're going to do the first couple of them, and then we're going to run out of time. And then we're going to go in part 2. We're going to count down the rest of them, all the way down to what we think is the number one most important test you need to use to maintain the good health of your stored fuel. Okay, so let's get started with number 10. Number 10 most important test is density. Okay, density is a descriptive test because it tells you something about a property of the fuel right now. That is, what is the weight-volume ratio of the fuel? Sometimes you'll find density expressed sometimes as density, like pounds per gallon. How many pounds, how many kilograms does a gallon of a given thing weigh? Other times you will hear it expressed as specific gravity. Specific gravity is a metric term, basically, and it's actually kilograms per liter. And specific gravity is actually expressed as the ratio of the density of fuel to the density of water. So the density of water is considered to have a specific gravity of 1. And so if you have something that's heavier than water, let's say water is 8.32 or 8.34 pounds per gallon. But let's say that something is, 16.64, that's 2x. 16.64 pounds per gallon, which is pretty heavy. The specific gravity for that would actually be 2.0. It's twice as dense, twice as heavy as water with the same volume. Other arenas, you may actually see API gravity. That is sometimes used when calculating something like cetane index. Okay, so density. Density is number 10 most important, and it is important. It's not an official ASTM test, but it does give you important clues about something that can be as important as, did somebody contaminate my diesel fuel? If that's a suspicion you might have. So let's talk about that. So number 2 diesel, all over the road, number 2 diesel fuel that you buy at the gas station pump or the truck stop. The density of that, there's never an exact density that's the same. It's a range because of the nature of what diesel fuel is, you're going to get a little bit of variance. And if you were to Google density of diesel fuel, what you're going to find is that the vast majority of diesel fuel stay within this relatively narrow specific gravity range of 0.82 all the way up to 0.88 specific gravity. You could find what that is in density terms if you just multiplied either of those by 8.32. That would give you pounds per gallon. So virtually all diesel fuel falls within that range. Now, take something else. Take gasoline. Gasoline's a hydrocarbon fuel just like number 2 diesel fuel is. But gasoline is lighter than diesel fuel. It contains smaller hydrocarbon molecules. So a gallon of gasoline by definition is going to weigh less than a gallon of diesel fuel. Um, Again, there's not an ASTM density specification. There's a density test. That's how you do it. But there's no specification. But what you'll find is gasoline almost always tends to have a specific gravity in the range of not 0.82 to 0.88 for diesel, but 0.71 up to 0.77. So if we know those two things, and we also know that sometimes you get situations where somebody might contaminate some gasoline with some diesel fuel, or vice versa. You have some diesel fuel, somebody accidentally drops some gasoline in it. The density test will give you a clue as to whether that might have happened. So if you have a diesel fuel sample and you know that it's typically specific gravity between 0.81 and 0.88, you have reasons to suspect that it might have got contaminated by something, but you don't know what. You run a density test. And let's say that your density comes back at 0.79. Well, 0.79 is lower than the typical low specific gravity range. That wouldn't prove that a specific thing was contaminating your diesel, but it's very strong evidence that something is in there. And also, very importantly, irrespective of what that contamination actually is, the fact is that if it's got a density of 0.79, it's probably out of spec in some other areas. You would probably want to run another one of the tests that's going to come later, and then you would use those results very likely to say something's wrong with this, and you can then start pursuing remediation. Okay, last thing to know about density or specific gravity is that it's always relative to temperature. Um, because if you know anything about physics, you know that temperature, the same volume of something can have a different weight at different temperatures. So when you hear density referenced, it's always referenced relative to some kind of normal temperature. Like, for example, they might reference specific gravity as 0.83 at 16 degrees centigrade. That's a pretty typical way to do it. So, having a density that is abnormally high or abnormally low, the biggest value for that and why it makes number 10 on our list is that it can be pretty strong, at least preliminary evidence that either something's contaminating the fuel, or the opposite, if it is where it should be, then it's a good hint that the fuel composition is actually in line with what it's supposed to be. So, number 10, most important fuel tests, density / specific gravity. And last point on that, that is one of those tests that is actually easy to do where you're at. All you need is what they call a hydrometer. It's a floating device that you put into a given volume of fuel, a specific volume, again, standardized volume of fuel, and it will actually give you a good idea of what your specific gravity is. So specific gravity or density isn't necessarily something that you are going to have to send out to a lab. Okay. Number 9, this is going to be the last one that we're going to do because we're at about 53 minutes already. And as my college professors you used to say, the mind can only absorb what the butt can endure, right? So number 9, most important test for fuel, cold filter plug point or cloud point. Okay. Cold filter plug point, sometimes we abbreviate it. We call it CFPP, cold filter plug point. The CFPP test is one of the essential tests for diesel fuel in the winter because it predicts the temperature at which you might experience diesel gelling problems. Now, what do we mean by that? When we say the point at which you might experience gelling problems, what we mean is the point at which the fuel has gelled so much that the paraffins have blocked the fuel filter and have shut the engine down. That's the kind of diesel gelling problem we're talking about. So remember that specific gravity or density was a descriptive test, right? Cold filter plug point, by its very nature, is the opposite. It's a predictive test. It is an excellent example of a predictive or an inferential test, because recall what we just said. You said that what we meant by diesel gelling problems is the point at which enough paraffin comes out that it plugs the fuel filter and shuts down the engine. Cold filter plug point is a predictive test that predicts the temperature at which that is likely to happen in a typical diesel fuel system and engine. So it's a predictive test. How they run it is they have a special apparatus, basically. And the apparatus has a vacuum line attached to it. And so they take a fuel sample and they cool it down. So they cool it down. And at a specific temperature, they will use the vacuum to actually draw fuel up into the apparatus, where it then runs through a specific filter screen, a little filter screen, kind of maybe about that big. And as the temperature of the fuel drops and as they keep running this, what they're looking for is they are looking for that fuel to flow back out of the apparatus, back through that filter, back into the sample. They're looking for all of that to drain back out within like 60 seconds. Well, as you lower the temperature and lower the temperature and lower the temperature, what's typically going to happen? That fuel eventually is going to reach a temperature where the paraffins are going to come out. And so as you keep running this test, what happens is those paraffins get caught in that little filter, and it starts taking longer and longer for it to drain back out of that apparatus. And so the cold filter plug point temperature is defined at the temperature at which the fuel can no longer completely flow through the screen or completely drain out of that apparatus within 60 seconds. So it is predictive, as you can probably tell, because it's trying to predict the temperature at which that exact kind of thing would happen in a typical diesel fuel system's fuel filter. Now, with any diesel fuel that you have, when they talk about cold weather performance of that, they will typically reference three temperatures related to that. They will reference cloud point temperature, they will reference what we were just talking about, cold filter plug point temperature, and they'll reference another one called pour point temperature. Now, most diesel fuels, as part of their specifications, will refer to at least one of these, typically either cloud point temperature or pour point temperature. They won't typically reference cold filter plug point. That is something that you will actually have to have done yourself. Now, if you have fuel from a supplier and they haven't given you the fuel's cloud point temperature, what are you going to do? Well, you can send it away and have that done. Typically, when you had that done, you would actually have both cloud point and cold filter plug point. But what happens if you really can't do that and you just want a quick predictive answer? Well, there are certain things, if you know the right information, there are certain things that you can use to your advantage in there. First thing is, if you happen to know the cloud point temperature, you can usually assume that for most number 2 diesel fuels, there's about a 5-degree difference. So let's say that your cloud point is 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Cloud point being the temperature at which you first start seeing paraffin crystals come out. And you can see them because the fuel starts to haze a little bit. It starts to cloud a little bit. That's cloud point. About 5 degrees below that is a typical difference. So if your cloud point is 20 degrees, your cold filter plug point may be 15 degrees. doesn't mean it's definitely going to be 15. For some fuels, it may be 3 degrees. Some fuels, it's maybe 6. But generally speaking, you could expect, if you went with those assumptions, you would generally probably be in the ballpark, in the useful ballpark. Now, what if you don't have the cloud point? What if your fuel supplier didn't give you any of that information? Well, there are certain things you can try to use to estimate the cloud point temperature if you can't send it away to have that done. When diesel fuel comes from the refinery, formulators at the refineries can vary the composition to tweak certain properties of the fuel. And sometimes what they'll do is in the winter, they will tweak the diesel fuel formulation a little bit to try and give it a lower cloud point. Now, in the areas where it does get cold, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Canada, Michigan, upstate New York, they might try to make the cloud point of the fuel a little colder. And what they will typically do is they will use what they call the 10th percentile temperature as the guide. The 10th percentile temperature is a term that refers to, in a given region, it's the temperature where in a given month, you would expect it to get down to that temperature no more than, let's say, 3 times per month. So let's say here in Florida, the 10th percentile temperature in January, I mean, we don't get down to 10 degrees Fahrenheit here in Florida. I mean, it is a little chilly right now, but off the top of my head, knowing what things are like in Florida, if you said that 10th percentile temperature in Florida in January was 35 degrees Fahrenheit, that's probably believable. Now go up to Michigan, or Minnesota. Get away from the water. Get away from the Great Lakes. Go to Minnesota. The 10th percentile temperature for Minnesota in January is not 35 degrees. It's probably, probably 30 degrees below that. Maybe it's minus 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or probably actually close to minus 15. It's a lot colder. And refineries know this, so they try the diesel fuel that you're getting in Minnesota is inherently probably going to have a cloud point that's lower than what you're going to get in Florida. So if you don't have the ability to send fuel away to have a cloud point and a cold filter plug point temperature test run, then the best thing that you can do is pay attention to the upcoming temperatures for the next 30 days. And try to see how cold historically it gets. Not necessarily how cold is it definitely going to get next month, but look over the last 10 years. You can get all that information on any number of websites. And it's also listed actually in ASTM D975. They actually have a list of those. And whatever the 10th percentile temperature is for your particular area, they typically will formulate the cloud point of fuel to be, let's say, 5 degrees above that or X degrees above that. And you can start to use that as a guide, which you then, if you know what those temperatures are, you can then look at the temperature for the upcoming month, for the time that you're in. And if you notice that, for example, in Kansas, for early February, it's going to be getting down, if I recall right, it's going to be getting down to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, more than a few times. So depending on what the other data is, somebody in Kansas might be able to use that to make a decision about whether they need to do something like use anti-gel, for example. Again, cloud point or cold filter plug point is a predictive test. It's a temperature that tries to predict when you are likely to have a problem that you need to do something about. And since all cold weather users have to deal with this, it definitely makes our top 10 of most important diesel fuel tests for fuel management, because shutting an engine down is not that happens. First of all, it happens at the least convenient times, and sometimes it can be pretty damaging, not necessarily to the engine, but to getting things done. So it's something that you definitely want to keep in mind. Okay, so we are going to stop there at number 9. And so for the next time, we are going to continue with numbers 8 through number 1 most important fuel test that you need to know and use for management of your stored fuel. So we appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Again, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to us on Stitcher or iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from. Recommend us to our friends, your colleagues, spread the word. If you haven't done so, also, what really helps us is if you would go in and give us a good rating, because that actually does help with the algorithms and such. And, leave us a comment. You can find information on all the things that we talked about in the show notes, which are located for every episode. They're located at our website, www.bellperformance.com. So until next time, I am Erik Bjornstad, your host of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. We will catch you next time. Bye-bye.